So good morning, everyone. My name is Ron Halber, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. And thank you for joining us today for what I'm sure will be a very insightful conversation with our friend, Ambassador Daniel Shapiro. I want to thank my colleagues, Alan Brody and Charlotte Barrios, for putting on this program. The JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the Jewish community in our nation's capital, representing the Jewish Federation and over 100 Jewish institutions. So much has unfolded in the last few weeks. That's an understatement. Israel launched precision strikes against Iran's nuclear facility and military targets, which prompted Iran to respond with ballistic missiles and drones aimed at Israeli population centers. The president ordered bunker buster strikes against, as well as the use of Tomahawk missiles against several Iranian facilities. And following a minimal response from Iran targeting U.S. base, a ceasefire seems to have been reached and is holding. But meanwhile, the war in Gaza continues, and more than 50 hostages are believed to be held. The president is calling for the charges to get dropped against the prime minister and is calling for an end to the war. And we're also seeing reports that a deal might be in the works, but Israeli officials are trying to temper expectations. To unpack all of that and the latest developments, we're honored to be joined today by Ambassador Shapiro, who served as the U.S. ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017. He's also served in top roles in the Department of State and Defense, as well as at the National Security Council. And he's currently a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. Before we begin, a few housekeeping rules. Ambassador Shapiro will speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, and the remaining time we'll be taking questions that come through the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to note that this call is being recorded, and closed captioning is available as well. With that, Ambassador Shapiro, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ron. Good to be with you, and good to be with the JCRC community, and it's a pleasure. I'll start with just a few general remarks, Ron. Maybe you and I'll go back and forth a bit as the questions come in. But it's obviously been a very intense 3 or 4 weeks, so it's worth getting together to try to unpack everything. I'll just put my cards on the table at the beginning, which is to say that the negotiations that President Trump was able to launch with Iran in April, I thought were hopeful and promising in the sense that they happened faster than I expected them to. He actually, I think, leveraged the presence of U.S. military forces in the region, already a significant presence since October 7th, sort of carrying on through the Biden administration years. And the strikes we were at the time conducting against the Houthis in Yemen, an important Iranian partner or proxy that was attacking U.S. ships and attacking Israel. And that presence and the sort of credible military threat it suggested, if there wasn't going to be a diplomatic process, got that diplomatic process underway faster than I expected. The Iranians are very effective and experienced in dragging out timelines of even getting talks started, where they meet, shape of the table, all the logistics, even before you get into substantive discussions. So when they launched in April, I was impressed by the use of the credible military threat to convey that the talks had to start. Then, of course, the talks started, and there was this somewhat muddled message initially from the Trump administration officials about what the actual goal of the talks were. In fact, I think in some ways the talks started so quickly, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who hasn't previously worked on this issue and didn't really have a full team around him yet, I don't think they had actually established what the goal of the negotiations were before they started the negotiations, maybe because they happened so quickly. Anyway, there were some contradictory statements about what the goal was. Eventually, they settled on the goal of no enrichment. And the reason why no enrichment was the standard, and I think the correct standard to set for those talks, was because of a lot of things that have changed in the last several years. I'll just turn back the clock very briefly to say I served in the Obama administration during the negotiations with Iran over the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that was signed in 2015. We know, of course, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, came to Congress to speak against it. Didn't like that deal. Many in our community were divided on that deal. I, as a U.S. ambassador to Israel at the time, wasn't involved in the negotiations on it, but was very involved in the discussions with Israel about it, and defended the deal as sort of the best option or the least bad option to buy the most time to keep Iran at a distance, a safe distance, about a year from the ability to produce a nuclear weapon, and to keep them there for about 10 to 15 years. Not without risk, but better than the alternatives. And I felt that way then. I still feel that way. In 2018, President Trump, of course, fulfilled the request of the Israeli government and that of many critics of the deal, and withdrew from the agreement. And I thought that was a mistake, because I thought it would give back some of the time that the JCPOA had provided. And I said that at the time. But I do think that whatever one's position was in 2015 or 2018 doesn't really help us identify what the right path forward is in 2025. However, we got there. We got here, and this is where we are. And what's changed are a couple of things. One is the advancement of the Iranian nuclear program. So Iran had continued once the U.S. was out of the JCPOA, first in the Trump administration, then more so in the Biden administration, and then even more so in the second Trump administration, to accelerate the enrichment of uranium to 60%. As you probably all know by now, 90% is weapons grade. 60% is close to 90%. It's not a very difficult technical process to go from one to the other, and there's no civilian purpose for 60%. So it's clearly done by the Iranians for leverage in the talks, or in talks that hadn't even started yet, and with a threat that they might enrich it to weapons grade. And even enriching one weapons worth of 90% uranium was always considered to be breakout. That's how we had always defined what a breakout was. And by the time these negotiations got underway, Iran had 10 bombs worth of 60% uranium, 60% enriched uranium, and that was documented by the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's no dispute about that. So they were very, very close to the ability to produce in days one, or in a few weeks, multiple weapons worth of nuclear weapons. Now, there's a separate process called weaponization. And this has always been the source of some dispute in the intelligence community, and depending on how one interprets it. The supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Khamenei, in 2003 had instructed Iranian scientists to cease work on what was then an active nuclear weapons program. And there's no evidence that he has ever reversed that. And he has various other proclamations that says Iran won't have nuclear weapons, but there has not been a decision to weaponize. However, and this is information I had access to when I was at the Pentagon for the last year of the Biden administration, I won't go into detail, but it's very clear that work has been done, research has been done, different organized groups of scientists have been consulting with one another in ways that would shorten the timeline to produce a nuclear weapon if and when they got that decision from the supreme leader, probably to a matter of months. So when people say to me, how close was Iran to being able to achieve a nuclear weapon, to make the decision on using force against it relevant, my answer is too close for comfort. By the time these talks had gotten underway in April, Iran had that 10 bombs worth of 60%. Iran had that shortened distance to weaponize. And the risk of them at any time of their choosing getting those two vectors to merge was too high. Now, the second thing that had changed was in 2024, after the October 7th attacks, and of course, Iran supports Hamas, but wasn't necessarily involved in the timing of that particular attack, but then urged its main proxy, Hezbollah, to join the war. Hezbollah did so. Hezbollah then was ultimately badly damaged by Israel. But in the meantime, Iran on two occasions did something it had never done. It attacked Israel directly in overt state-on-state acts of war, to massive barrages, really unprecedented in the history of warfare, barrages of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. The first one at April 13th, the second one on October 1st, with twice as many ballistic missiles as in the first. The United States, of course, helped Israel defend itself. Israel's air defenses, U.S. air defenses. In April, a big coalition of other countries that helped contribute largely defeated those attacks, and so the impact was limited. But it doesn't change the fact that Iran had changed the whole pattern or the whole methodology that it used to conduct its campaign against Israel. Iran has long called this a regime for death to Israel, Israel's destruction, Israel being removed from the map. But its methodology was to use the proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, Shia militias, anybody other than themselves, to do deniable terrorist missile strikes, all sorts of other attacks that wouldn't be officially traced all the way back to Tehran, even though Tehran was often the funder, the armor, the motivator of those entities. But once you're in a direct state-on-state act of war against Israel with those types of weapons, those ballistic missiles particularly, it's a really different story. And all you have to do is imagine any one of those ballistic missiles being tipped with a nuclear warhead, and we're in a completely different world. So the risk of how close they were coming on the nuclear capabilities and the demonstrated willingness to attack Israel directly, I think were massive changes. Of course, a third change was that Israel had, in its response to that second attack, it had damaged Iran's most significant air defenses, the S-300 units supplied by Russia. Really destroyed them. And it had also, in September and October, more or less wiped out Hezbollah's aggressive capabilities against Israel, not completely, but enough that main vector of a second strike or a deterrent that Iran had, which was the 150,000 or so rockets and missiles that Hezbollah had aimed at Israel, was largely removed from the table. So there was kind of an opportunity to move against the Iranian program that hadn't existed before. So those are three very significant changes. Anyway, the talks went through April and May and early June. The president had set a 60-day deadline, or at least target. He had said no enrichment. Eventually, he landed on the position that no enrichment, which I think was the correct position, because that's how you make sure Iran has no pathway to a nuclear weapon. And then it was pretty clear he wanted a bit more time for the negotiations. And he had more negotiations planned for day 63. But at some point, the prime minister came to him and said, I really have a window. I can't wait till they rebuild their air defenses. We've been planning this attack. We have to go. And the president could have put up a red light, as it were. Not sure if the prime minister would have agreed to it, but he could have tried. But he didn't. He more or less indicated, Israel had the U.S. Support for these strikes. Well, the first night, Secretary Rubio's statement was very standoffish. These were, said these were unilateral Israeli strikes. The U.S. wasn't involved, obviously trying to prevent any blowback against U.S. forces. And but then when it became clear in the first day or two that Israel was having significant success against nuclear sites, it hit several of them, again, Natanz and Isfahan in particular, against ballistic missile production and launch capabilities, against the air defenses. Israel established air superiority in under 48 hours, and against leadership targets and IRGC and military and nuclear scientists. Then the president decided this was something he wanted to sort of associate himself with. He started speaking about having established air superiority, even though it was all Israel. There were, of course, U.S. support in various ways for this operation, but it was definitely an Israeli operation. Anyway, as the operation was conducted, fundamental to the question of the success of the operation was, would it eliminate Iran's enrichment capability? And that meant there had to be a solution to deal with Fordo, the deeply buried underground enrichment facility where they were doing most of their 60% enrichment. And of course, Israel might have had its own creative and ingenious solutions to that, cutting power, commandos, we don't know. Maybe it could have been done in a negotiation, which was, of course, were suspended during the war. And then the third option, obviously, was the U.S. To use our B-2s and our 30,000-pound bunker buster massive ordnance penetrators. President gave a 2-week window. Then he attacked on the third day of the 2 weeks. I mean, all of this, I think, was a bit faster than I expected. I did expect, or I expected this confrontation or this decision point on military action to happen this year. I thought no later than October, because there's a deadline in October for the snapback, the return of UN sanctions against Iran, since they're out of compliance with their obligations under the JCPOA. The European countries hold the trigger for that. So I thought the negotiations might drag through the summer, and then by the early fall, we'd have this moment of decision based on the Israeli need to act faster, and then based on President Trump's decision to not extend the sort of the deadlines he was offering. It happened earlier than I expected. But I do think this confrontation was inevitable and it was necessary. The U.S. strikes were effective for sure. I'm very familiar with the plan that was executed with the B-2s and the MOPS. It was described very thoroughly by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the briefing at the Pentagon a couple of days after the strikes, in which 12 massive ordnance penetrators were dropped on Fordo, six, I guess, each down two different ventilation shafts. And the bombs hit their targets, and the bombs performed as planned and designed. The question now on everybody's mind is, well, how much damage did they do, and how much does this set the Iranian program back? This is not something that there's an easy mathematical conclusion, or certainly not one can draw quite this early. It takes time to develop all the streams of information and intelligence, hopefully getting eyes on inspections at some point by IAEA inspectors to really know the answer to this question. But I'll say just a few thoughts about how to think about it. First is, based on those weapons hitting their targets, I have little doubt that the destruction they caused within the chamber of the enrichment facility underground in Fordo was probably very, very extensive. It probably makes it unusable, and the equipment in it unusable at all, and it would have to be redone to be usable. So that's I think it's very likely that facility is out of commission as an enrichment facility anytime in the foreseeable future. The same is likely true at the other main enrichment facility, Natanz. There's both an above ground facility that the Israelis had largely destroyed, and there was an underground facility there which they had attacked, and we did with two additional MOPS as well on the date of the U.S. strikes. So Iran is probably currently unable to conduct enrichment in the way they had been conducting it at either of those sites. A major question is, do they have access to the 60% enriched uranium that was documented by the IAEA? It could be buried in Fordo. It could be buried somewhere else. They may have to dig it out, but there's also certainly a possibility that they moved it ahead of time. They know where it is. It's in safekeeping, or they've even, of course, divided it into multiple locations. And then the question is, do they still have any centrifuges, not installed, but centrifuges in storage, or centrifuge production capability? They could make new ones and then find a site underground somewhere, maybe without inspections, and quickly try to feed the 60% uranium into it and enrich it to 90%. And the answer is, we don't know, but they may have that capability. And if so, over a period of months, and I'd say it's hard to know exactly how many months, but I'm guessing 6 to 12. It's not out of the question that they could find a place and install the centrifuges and bring the uranium and do that kind of enrichment. Obviously, if we and the Israelis and the IAEA are able to observe that, there's all kinds of ways one could delay that. So we shouldn't be bound by a particular timeline, because timelines can be extended through military strikes, more strikes, as the president said he's prepared to do, through negotiations, through sanctions, through sabotage. There's many ways one can say, yes, they have a technical capability to do something within a given period of time, but there are many ways to extend that time. So that's one way of thinking about it. The second thing is, on the weaponization side, a very important facility was destroyed. It was first hit by the Israelis and then by us with the Tomahawk missiles from the submarine, which was the uranium conversion facility at Isfahan that converts the uranium, which is enriched in the form of a gas, into a metal. And the metal is the core of a nuclear weapon. And there's an entire process to do that conversion.
Can you explain? Can you explain the difference between the enrichment and the conversion for people? Or is it the same thing? You say because one's a conversion, one's an enrichment facility. I'm wondering the difference.
Right.
I did not take any nuclear science
I'm
courses.
not. Yeah, I'm not a nuclear physicist either, but the enrichment is just how the uranium is prepared to have the capacity to have the explosive effects within a bomb. So that's how that needs to get to 90% enrichment, but that's in the form of a gas.
Okay.
And then in order to place it inside the warhead of a nuclear weapon, it has to be converted from a gas into a metal. And this is a complicated process that I can't describe in greater detail, but there was a separate facility with all the necessary technology to do that. That's now been completely leveled. And so that would have to be rebuilt. That's probably not an overnight or 6 month or year even process. So it's quite likely that Iran has a shorter timeline on breakout through enrichment than it does on weaponization, because it would have to rebuild the nuclear the uranium conversion facility. But these are all estimates. Now there's a lot swirling around about this. Of course, the president came out within a couple of hours of the strike and said the program had been completely and totally obliterated. And of course, that's not something he could have known based on that timeline. It takes days to weeks to put together a proper battle damage assessment. So that was, I think, unfortunate to use that kind of language, especially if it puts pressure on intelligence analysts to produce reports that are consistent with what the president has already said, based on facts he didn't have when he said it. So that's one problem. Then, of course, there was that first report that was leaked, I guess, reported on CNN and elsewhere from the Defense Intelligence Agency, saying the program had only been set back a few months. But that report even itself said it's low confidence. That means that's based on the minimum amount of information, that there's other sources of intelligence that they would want to corroborate it, that they would need to consult with other intelligence agencies that hadn't reported in yet. So I don't think we take very much from that either. I think the real answer is we don't know. It takes time, and our intelligence agencies are hopefully doing that work and doing it without pressure to produce particular points of analysis or conclusions. And between that and what we hope will be negotiations to get the IAEA inspectors back in, we'll be able to put together the proper kind of assessment of exactly how far back it's been set back. But it's been set back. I don't think we have any question about that. Are there risks to using using military force? Yes, there are risks. One was, of course, was demonstrated when the Iranians fired missiles at our base in Qatar. Fortunately, it had been evacuated. There was obviously notice. This was a bit performative, and we were able to defeat that attack. But we shouldn't assume that's the last time Iran will try to retaliate, either against our bases elsewhere in the region or against other targets, Israeli, Jewish targets outside, through terrorist attacks, through groups they sponsor, cyber attacks. There's many ways Iran may, over time, days, weeks, even years, try to level the score. That's something that we have to be aware of. But there was also risk in not going, which was that they were so close to that nuclear breakout capability, having already demonstrated their intent and willingness to attack Israel directly. So I think one has to balance those risks. The best course, of course, and the president and the administration have indicated this is what they're trying to do, is to work with Gulf partners, work with the Europeans, and try to get the Iranians back into a negotiation. And that negotiation should still focus on a no enrichment standard. It should still focus on getting full access of the IAEA inspectors so that we can actually put eyes on the enriched uranium, on the various facilities, especially any new ones that they might try to stand up. Obviously, Iran is going to be reluctant to do that. They thought they were in a negotiation when they were attacked. So they're going to be very skeptical about it. But there's still leverage. That October deadline for the snapback of additional sanctions I mentioned is still out there, could still be used as leverage to get the Iranians to come to the table. One of the other risks, and one of the things people had talked about for a long time, about why the use of military force might be problematic, is that despite how really aggressive and awful both to its own people and to the region this Iranian regime has been, there was some sort of balance between the relative moderates, I use that term advisedly, people like the president, Pezeshkian, and the relative hardliners, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which are kind of the shock troops that are the base of the regime's pillars of support. And that if following an attack, the swing might go to the hardliners, and the hardliners might say, wait a minute, we stayed intentionally just below the threshold of an actual nuclear weapon so that we had the option to do it, but by never actually doing it, we sort of had our hands kind of clean by the international community standard. But now we were attacked. It didn't provide that deterrent. The only way we can provide the deterrent we need is to actually actually produce a nuclear weapon. And so there could be energy in the system to actually move faster toward producing a nuclear weapon. So that we're going to have to watch carefully. And the Israelis, with their intelligence, obviously very, very deeply penetrated in Iran. We saw that in the early days. Are going to have to watch very carefully. And indeed, it's not out of the question. It might take additional strikes. Now, we don't want to. No one wants to get drawn into a forever war or any kind of deep Middle East military entanglement. Certainly, no one wants to put troops on the ground in Iran, and nobody should be talking about regime change as a military, an outcome of a military campaign. I don't think that was the Israelis, despite a little bit of overheated rhetoric, and it definitely wasn't. It shouldn't be the U.S. role. We've learned hard lessons that way. Having said that, and this is where I'll pause, Ron, is I think this is a sort of plastic moment, both in Iran and in the region. And we see the Iranian regime cracking down on people it claims have been supporting Israel through espionage, or just anybody they fear it could be a source of dissent. We know that the Iranian people, by and large, I think there's decent data on this, despise this regime. They believe it has been deeply brutal to their own people, many political prisoners, deeply corrupt, deeply mismanaged, terrible shortages of electricity, water, healthcare, and the like. It has squandered enormous resources, I mean, to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to pursue ideological campaigns, nuclear weapons, arming terrorist organizations in other countries, trying to attack Israel or destroy Israel, trying to dominate numerous Arab states. None of that has done anything to help the prosperity and security of the Iranian people. So I think there is a source of anti-regime sentiment that may at some point be tapped. We don't know when, we don't know how. It's going to be an Iranian process, an internal Iranian process, maybe with some Iranian diaspora elements as well. But it's not something outsiders are going to be able to control. But it is something that if we see the moment, then we can offer at least moral support to Iranian dissidents, to call out regime brutality, to prepare for a moment of transition, because transitions can be very messy and can go sideways. And we don't want something worse to emerge even after this regime, but be prepared with reconstruction, with advice, with sanctions relief for a different regime that would help them rebuild. I think that's a planning process that I hope would get very much underway almost immediately. Last thing is, it may open opportunities elsewhere in the region. And Ron, you kind of alluded to this. Maybe we'll get to it more in the questions. I think there is a moment now to leverage the success of the campaign against Iran, which isn't total success, but it was very successful, to bring the war in Gaza to an end. And it feels like there's a change in Israeli thinking on that maybe is the right moment to say we should do this in one shot, one hostage deal, get all the 50 hostages home, end the war. It may be that Hamas, seeing its supporter and patron Iran weaken so much, will also be more flexible in certain of those terms. I'm not sure they're just going to agree to completely abandon Gaza, but Qatar, as the negotiator, who is also a negotiator between the U.S. and Iran on the ceasefire, might be able to leverage this moment to get a little more flexibility from the Iranian side, from the Hamas side. And then we'll get to it, but there's clearly active discussion underway about potential steps forward on agreements between Israel and various of its neighbors. Syria has been mentioned, Lebanon has been mentioned, Saudi Arabia has been mentioned, even countries outside the region have been mentioned as potential candidates to join the Abraham Accords, or at least take steps in direction of normalization, or maybe non-belligerence in the first phase with Israel. I'm not close enough to most of those conversations to have a good enough sense of how realistic that is. But there are certainly possibilities. There's a Syrian government trying to get itself established and find its footing that the U.S. is helping with sanctions relief. And so we have leverage and the ability to steer and encourage them in positive directions. But there's still a lot of hurdles. There's still a government in Israel that doesn't want to talk about a Palestinian future path to a Palestinian state. And maybe most Israelis don't want to have that conversation. That is a barrier for the Saudis. There's still the fate of Israeli military positions in Syria, as well as the longstanding dispute between Israel and Syria over the Golan Heights that Israel captured in 1967. Hezbollah is much weaker in Lebanon, but is still present in Lebanon. And the Lebanese government has done a good job of trying to build on its weakness and establish state authority. But that may not be the only test of whether they're able to go all the way toward a full recognition agreement with Israel. But there are possibilities here, and I hope and think the administration is seizing on them. But that's going to take a lot of very dedicated and sophisticated diplomacy to try to pull all of these threads together on Iran, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia. Maybe you can't get them all, but at least advance the ones you can. Ron, why don't I stop there and we'll turn to the questions.
I could have listened to you for another half an hour, Ambassador. That was, as usual, whether we've had in private conversations or in public conversations. Thank you for your brilliant analysis. We got some good questions. I'm going to try and sort of combine them so that I cover as much as possible. Israel, after October 7th, Israel has now moved, I think, from a policy of, they always had a policy of preemption when they were striking, deliveries of Iranian missiles to Hezbollah or things, but they really have upped it now by going ahead because that's changed the whole battle, the whole doctrine. You see the re-engagement of the Begin doctrine. There'll be no enemy country of Israel will be around to develop nuclear weapons. And until then, until the recent strikes, you could say Israel's primary method of preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon was clandestine activities, was the fact that Israel reportedly has its own nuclear capability and deterrence. But now, after what happened on October 7th, the fact that the Israelis were so active in striking and dismantling proxies around the region has struck Iran. You take that new military doctrine into effect. Second, you take the fact that the Iranians have been struck and decimated and their air defenses are down. What is the likelihood that the Iranians will think that diplomacy could actually bring about a successful that the Iranians will actually agree to a no enrichment, considering their national pride has been damaged, and part of the theological basis of their regime is the elimination of the state of Israel?
Yeah, it's a heavy lift. I have to be honest. I mean, I thought it was, again, the right standard to say no enrichment because, and that's a tougher standard, obviously, than the original 2015 agreement. But the reasons I stated is because of the way the program has advanced, the way Iranian behavior has changed. But it was always going to be tough, and that's why I thought a confrontation of this kind was likely and probably inevitable and probably necessary at some point during this year. It may be harder still in the wake of these attacks. Again, the Iranians have, as you said, sort of a kind of ideological commitment to this program, a kind of national pride element of their ability to enrich uranium. There are probably even members of the Iranian opposition who also sense that Iran is the kind of great nation that should have that nuclear capability, and they see threats to the Iran security that they may use to justify it. So I don't think we can easily assume they're going to take to that, which is why we have to use all the tools that we have. So we have existing sanctions, of course, but we do have a fairly heavy hammer of additional sanctions. So in that sense, the negotiation hasn't really changed, or the format of the negotiation hasn't changed from before and after the strikes, other than that the strikes occurred, which is not nothing. It's changed a lot of facts on the ground. But in terms of the fact that there is real leverage coming in the form of these snapback sanctions in October, if Iran does not meet the U.S. or the international community's requirements. And I don't, again, I expect this is going to be a vigorous debate internally within the Iranian system. They're going to drive a hard bargain. They always do. They're going to delay on getting the IAEA inspectors into the country to try to establish some of the facts that we would like to have as a baseline for these talks. They retain the ideological commitment and the hostility to the United States, to Israel, to various others in the region, and the belief that they, need this, and again, that risk that those in the regime who will argue that they need to go in the other direction. They did not have the deterrent they wanted. They lost the one they had in Hezbollah. They couldn't defend themselves, and therefore the only thing that would protect them from additional attacks is actually to sprint toward a nuclear weapon. So that is why we can't rule out additional strikes if those are necessary. But this is the work of diplomacy, and I think what I think it's important is that the president not be in such a rush for a deal. We know he loves deals. That he take a bad deal or take the first off ramp to a deal if it doesn't actually meet his own standard of how the Iranian nuclear program is constrained. I think it's definitely preferable not to have to do additional military strikes. Among the reasons for that, of course, is that Israel's air defenses were stretched. They were broadly successful with a lot of U.S. support. There was a lot of U.S. assistance in defeating those ballistic missile attacks against Israel. But as we know, about 28 Israelis were killed. Hundreds of homes were destroyed. Thousands of people were injured, and those are fearsome weapons. Those ballistic missiles. Iran was also stretched just because they were losing launchers, and many of those missiles were not that effective. But Israel doesn't want to get drawn into a weeks-long exchange, because at some point missiles do get through, and they do cause damage. So we don't want to be in a extended series of exchanges. And that's why I think the ceasefire worked to everybody's advantage when it was called. But of course, if there's no alternative and we see them sprinting towards some sort of nuclear capability, that has to be on the table to use.
Right. So I don't want to. I'll make one pro-Israel point, if I can go past on this, that the Israelis were targeting facilities and that the Iranians were targeting population centers. And there's a big difference between that. One question is, has the military attack made it easier for Israel perhaps to do follow-up attacks against these facilities without the United States help? In other words, have the bunker busters caused so much damage that the Israelis possibly have the munitions within their arsenals that are necessary now to follow up to keep future facilities disabled without the United States help?
Well, if they were to try to establish an enrichment facility in Fordo, depending on how bad the damage, just the structural damage is within Fordo, Israel would still have some of those same challenges that they had before. But I don't think that's going to be the near term way they would look to reestablish that capability. Natanz, I said, Israel had already found a reasonably good solution even for the underground facility, and that was joined by the U.S. So I think Natanz is also probably out of business. I think the scenario that we're most concerned about is we know there are additional underground tunnels. I'm not sure we know what's in them, but they're very, very deep, almost as deep or deeper than Fordo, at Isfahan, near Isfahan. And so if Iran decided they would set up an undeclared, smaller enrichment facility with their remaining centrifuges, if they have them, or with additional ones they can produce, and bring the enriched uranium to that site and try to do enrichment there, that would be a challenge for both Israel and for us to reach with the munitions that we've been using. But there's a lot of detail around that. So, look, there is a concern. It's obviously Israel's deep intelligence penetration of the Iranian regime has given them access and given us all information. That means that there may be methods other than aerial bombs to address some of these scenarios, especially in cases where aerial bombs may not be effective. So we have to be, kind of creative and thoughtful about all the different methods that we might have to use if we see that kind of activity going on.
So one question that came here is, will either Russia or China or both get involved in helping Iran reestablish their nuclear capacity?
I think not immediately. Russia, of course, is very distracted and occupied by its war in Ukraine, its war of choice and invasion of Ukraine, I should say. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be heading toward an end anytime soon. So there's limits to what they can and I think will or have the attention or resources to do for Iran. They don't want Iran to be a nuclear power. They do welcome Iran being sufficiently dangerous that it ties the United States down in the Middle East and forces us to keep a big presence there and potentially get pulled into conflicts from time to time. That is not necessarily against the Russian interest. But in terms of actually helping them rebuild the nuclear facilities, I don't think that's an extremely likely near-term prospect. China, same, doesn't really see any benefit to Iran having a nuclear weapon and the likelihood that produces a nuclear arms race with the Saudis, with perhaps the Emiratis, Egyptians, Turks, others in the region, and the way that could destabilize the region from which they derive the great majority of their energy imports. So Iran is going to be helpful to Iran, rather China is going to be helpful to Iran economically. It'll continue to try to buy Iranian oil. It will certainly stand against various UN Security Council condemnations. It's not going to be a partner to us in toughening sanctions on Iran, but I don't think China is going to see it as in its interest to help help Iran rebuild those nuclear facilities. That's not the thing I'm most worried about.
Or even their air defenses for that matter.
Right. Russia had the S-300s before. They couldn't restore them after Israel took them out last October. I don't see that happening anytime soon. Iran has air defenses they'll be able to rebuild to some degree. I must say the Israeli elimination of most of the Iranian air defense, at least in Western Tehran, Western and Central Tehran, was a big factor in the U.S. ability to conduct the strikes we did because normally if you're going to conduct that kind of strike and you're going to bring in such a valuable asset like the B-2 even with its stealth capabilities, there's periods of the mission that there's some vulnerability. You would want to eliminate or suppress as much if not all of the enemy air defense before you bring in the big guns, and we were able to shorten the time of our own campaign because we didn't need to do as much of that preparation because the Israelis had already done it for us.
Right. Several of the military analyses that I've read said that the Israeli clearing of a nuclear corridor of an air corridor by destroying a lot of the anti-missile defense allowed the United States to probably conduct it days earlier than it would have had to do otherwise.
That's correct.
We can switch from Iran, although we can talk about Iran for hours, and go to Gaza. First question is, you've seen in the last few days even from the prime minister using the words, we've got to get the hostages home now. You've heard that the military has reached its goal of taking 75% of Gaza and is going to report back during security cabinet meetings that they've met their goal, meaning and you hear even Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, who's going to probably challenge him, saying, it's time to end the war. It's time to keep troops around the perimeter of Gaza so no October 7th can happen again. Would you see momentum coming towards a ceasefire, even when Israel has announced they're planning to increase their firepower even more?
Well, it feels like there's some momentum, and I hope there is. I mean, look, I think most Israelis, and this has been true now for 2 or 3 months, really since the previous ceasefire broke down, 70% of Israelis in almost every poll have said the priority should be to get all the hostages home. There are 50 remaining, we think 20 alive, 30 probably deceased. But they all need to come to American deceased Americans and continue to be held. And so that should be the priority and the sequence, right? There's no change, I think, in the Israeli consensus that Hamas cannot be allowed to continue to rule Gaza, and over time that needs to change, and they're going to need the support and help of Arab states, and to empower an alternative Palestinian leadership. And there are various steps that really have to be undertaken, but that can't be permitted, that Gaza continue to be ruled by Hamas after October 7th. But in terms of sequencing, if pursuing that goal means that the hostages will languish in the tunnels for many more months, or God forbid longer, if it means more of them could die because the IDF would have to operate in areas where they're being held, it's not worth it. And at least initially, the sequence and the priority has to be on getting the hostages out. So you're starting to hear that more coming out of the government, more coming from the prime minister. What, of course, has been a challenge for him all along has been the members of his government, particularly Minister Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who have said that they would not support any hostage deal that would end the war, that would be until, that final elimination of Hamas presence in Gaza was completed. Hard to know how to measure that. And that they would actually vote to bring down the government if he did that. And of course, the prime minister doesn't want to lose the government. Now, there's a lot of folks who are saying, in the wake of the success in Iran, he might be more willing to take that risk. He might want to push it out past the end of the current Knesset session, then he buys himself 2 or 3 months while the Knesset is in recess, but that he'd be more open to either calling an election or going to an election if he lost certain coalition partners, on the basis of having struck the Iranian nuclear facilities, gotten the United States to join, gotten all the hostages home, even if even there was some unfinished business about how the last remnants of Hamas would be kind of excised from Gaza. I think Naftali Bennett, former Prime Minister Bennett's comments suggest that there is support for that approach, even from the right. Bennett is trying to run for Prime Minister sort of from the right, and as a alternative, as change, but not necessarily change that goes to a center or center-left direction. And so I think there is a base of support for that course of action if the prime minister takes it. Yeah, it could get all tangled up, right? If the desire is to sort of lock in a Saudi deal or a Syrian deal, and those things can't get put together all at the same time. And there's obviously also this factor of the prime minister's trial that seems to be part of this discussion. I don't really think it should be part of this discussion, but it sounds as though some are advocating, whether he is or not, I don't know, but some are advocating that in order for him to do the deal, to get all the hostages out, he needs to have his trial dismissed. That doesn't sound like an appropriate connection, if you ask me, but that's an internal Israeli matter. What is certainly not only an internal Israeli matter is when the president of the United States tweets that he has opinions about how the Israeli judicial proceedings should occur. That really seemed very inappropriate to me. Maybe one of the most blatant interventions in internal Israeli affairs we've ever seen by a United States president. And he's obviously got popularity in Israel based on any number of things he's done, most recently the Fordo strikes. But that doesn't mean that he should be involving himself in that issue, nor implicitly or otherwise suggesting that issue should have bearing on the decision about how to get the hostages released.
We did a webinar early on in the war, like a week or so after October 7th. I'm sorry, about a month after October 7th, when Israeli troops had started going into Gaza. And one of the things that Dennis Ross said was about the danger of using the term total victory, and about speaking about this war in almost Churchillian terms, which is having just come back from the UK, understanding what those words mean. So the question becomes is that if the prime minister has consistently said, the two things must happen. We must get all the hostages home, and Hamas must be destroyed. And part of what we've heard of Hamas being destroyed is that they can't be in control. They've got to be exiled, and that they can no longer have any governmental or infrastructural footprint. And Hamas as an organization obviously is ideologically driven to be willing to die to maintain its position. At the same time, you've got these these two right-wing extremists in the Israeli government that probably would put pressure on the prime minister not to leave without having accomplished that goal. Can you envision a scenario where the prime minister will say we've destroyed Hamas as an entity, and that other parties will come up to shore up the government, even if they leave, to give at least for a temporary basis for him to allow to seek an end to that conflict and then go into new elections?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think the opposition leader Yair Lapid and some of the other opposition parties have sort of indicated that they would not act to bring down the government if the government was taking action that would bring the hostages home. And so, at least on the short term, and maybe the closer the government gets to the end of its time, the election has to be no later than the fall of 2026. Maybe this becomes less of a risk for the prime minister. What the prime minister's always been concerned about is, well, they might, support me for a month to get the hostages home, but then my fate is in their hands, and then at any time of their choosing, they can bring down the government. So, but again, that maybe that concern is lessening. Again, the fact that in one more month the Knesset will go out of session until the end of October. You can't really very easily bring down the government while the Knesset is in recess. By then, if you planned an election starting in this fall, it wouldn't happen until the spring of 2026. That's near the government's term anyway. Maybe these timelines line up in a way that are less threatening or less concerning. But that's I think Dennis's point about the danger of demanding total victory or setting that as the marker of what is being tried to achieve is very difficult in the Middle East, maybe in other places as well. Total victory in World War II involved obviously the total surrender of Japan and Germany. We know what that required. We also know that it resulted in U.S. and other countries' occupation of those countries for many years. I don't think any Israeli that I know really wants to have Israel be in full occupation of Gaza. So if you want Hamas removed, it may not be only done through military means. There may be other means of getting Arab government support for their exile of key Hamas elements, leaders and fighters and the like. But you also have to have an alternative. You have to have some different source of authority in Gaza, whether that is Palestinian Authority derived or connected, or some alternative Palestinian leadership that isn't Palestinian Authority. Whether it's an Arab stabilization force with the Egyptian, Emirati, maybe some other countries contributing troops. There are all sorts of ideas that have been proposed, but if you don't go for any of those, your options basically are Israel in full and permanent, or at least semi-permanent control, or Israeli withdrawal, leaving kind of nothing, leaving Hamas and maybe Mogadishu style chaos just across their border. So that's why these day after questions have been bedeviling this discussion. Certainly most of the time I was in the Biden administration and since, because that question of what follows the end of the actual military campaign is critical. And if you don't have an alternative source of authority, it'll either be Israel or it'll be Hamas.
So following October 7th, Israel had a great deal of the world's support after what happened to its the mass murder of 12 million Jews, 1,200 Jews, 1,200 and thousands injured, and we know about the sexual assaults and the horrific things that took place. But now we're 16, 18 months into this war, and Israel's international reputation is really taken a major hit, especially among European countries, whom she relies on, in addition to the United States, for support. And so the question is, do you think Israel will be able to restore its international standing with other European countries after a ceasefire? Or how long will it be before Israel can reestablish a more positive, or at least a more neutral image among Western Europe and among the areas where they key? And I should also note, obviously, that the British and the French, as well as Arab states, have been involved in the defense of Israel as well through those two strikes, so that there is more cooperation, that Israel gets often behind the scenes. And I'm sure some of the Arab states are very grateful that Israel's taken out some of the Iranian nuclear material without being able to publicly say it. So there's more support, but it's quiet. But among democracies where you're seeing the growth of this left-wing anti-Israel sentiment, including in the United States, how do you think that this is something that could be corrected?
Well, it's not going to be easy. There is anti-Israel sentiment growing, definitely in Europe, definitely, sorry to say, in the United States. It's certainly on the far left. It's also on the far right. Look, I think getting to the end of the Gaza war is part of this, right? I think that is a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary because that remains the source of a great deal of the anguish, and memories may be short, and people may have moved on much too fast from October 7th, and have forgotten the horrors of that day and those attacks. But people are human, and they are aware of suffering in Gaza. There's obviously great suffering in Gaza, including for civilians, and that is going to drive emotions on this. I don't think we should imagine it won't. Israel, I think, has at different points in the conflict, and certainly when I was in the Biden administration, we were very active in working with them on this, done as much as they could, or we've tried to get them to do as much as possible, and at various times they did more, and various times they didn't do as much, to surge humanitarian assistance into Gaza, which is desperately needed. Big problem with how that assistance is often hijacked or stolen by Hamas, used for themselves, and used as a means of political power. I think that's a real problem, and to some degree that is compromised in a lot.
Which is something about we really don't often hear about. We often hear about
sure,
and it's right.
and it's compromised. Yeah, and it's not compromised some of these international organizations. That said, the current arrangement, there was about a 10-week pause in any assistance going in after the end of the ceasefire. I think that was a big mistake, and did bring Gaza really close to the brink of real famine. Once aid began to flow again, not sufficient. Again, some problems of Hamas diversion. That's a real problem, and it shouldn't be minimized. This new Gaza Humanitarian Foundation arrangement with the private security is, let's say, it's problematic. It is delivering food directly to Gazans, and there's clearly been some success in that, but in very limited locations. It looks to many like it is in service of Smotrich's plan, which is to consolidate the population in very limited areas in preparation for expelling them or getting them to leave Gaza, which I don't think is going to happen, but that's how it looks to a lot of people. And then there have been these security incidents around the distribution points where people are been shot. We don't know all the details of who's shooting or how that's happening, but it's obviously not a very safe and orderly way of getting the aid distributed, even though there are many people who are actually getting their aid that way and not having to go through Hamas to get it. So I'm not trying here to say it's got no value, but I'm saying it's problematic, and it fuels attitudes and concerns overseas. And I do think, even when the guns fall silent, when the hostages come home, may that be very soon, when hopefully we're on to some different Gaza leadership, so that we're talking about a non-Hamas ruled Gaza and some opportunity to rebuild. Obviously, there will be stories, there will be accounts that will come out. International media have mostly not gotten into Gaza. They will get in, they will see immense destruction and a lot of suffering. So I suspect there will be a long tail for how that impacts attitudes about Israel in Europe and elsewhere, and that's a fact of life. And so the fact that Israel was attacked and had every right to defend itself, and much of that has been focused. I think it's been focused on attacking Hamas, but also obviously there have been civilian casualties. There's been civilian suffering due to insufficient assistance. Is going to be part of this story for a long time. And it will take, I think, it will take time, and it will take work, and hopefully it will take a different and better atmosphere in the region with a new and peaceful Palestinian leadership in Gaza, with Israel expanding its relations with various other Arab states, with that changing and improving regional picture, putting back on the table how Israelis and Palestinians can find their way to some endpoint to their conflict in the future. It's not going to look like the two-state solution we might have imagined during the Oslo years, but it has to have some endpoint if you're going to get there. And so, that can obviously help affect and change and shape attitudes elsewhere as well. So I think there's a lot of work to do to build out of what's, of course, been, a tragedy in every direction for our closing on 2 years now.
So, Ambassador, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us, for your extremely thoughtful analysis, for taking the time to cover, 20 countries in an hour, and everything that is going on in the Middle East, which is obviously so thorough and complex. I think you, in addition to laying out how many possibilities are, realize just how many unknowns there are, and how we're going to just have to navigate this very slowly, and how complicated and interconnected this is as a region. And that I guess the only thing we can all pray for is that peace will soon come to the region and the hostages will come home.